Hi, I'm Naya Kleindl. I'm a senior at South Dakota State University, and as a part of my History and Systems of Psychology course, I have been asked to share the story of an influential psychologist of my choosing. And if you clicked on this video, you probably know I'm talking about Karen Horney, the German Neo-Freudian psychologist who created feminine psychology. The outspoken and number one advocate for self-help and self-analysis. The founder of the American Institute of Psychoanalysis. Praised by people like Abraham Maslow, who credits her work for helping him create the infamous Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and Erik Erikson, who credits her for helping him create the first stage of his theory of psychosocial development. But first things first, let's go back a little and talk about how this German woman ended up coming to America to become this incredible psychologist. The year is 1901, and we have a young Karen Horney who just started at the prestigious Hamburg Real Gymnasium, a high school in Germany for only those with the most accelerated intellectual abilities. It also happens to be a bit of a boys' club, and Horney is one of very few girls permitted to be here. She studies here for 5 years before becoming one of the first German women to study medicine, despite the wishes of her father and probably her classmates and a bunch of other dudes who don't think that women should be in medicine. This is when she meets her husband, Oscar Horney. They get married in 1909, move to Berlin, and have their first baby girl, Bridget. Then in 1915, Horney graduates with her medical degree, and 2 years later, she gives her very first presentation on psychoanalysis. And in 1926, she decides to separate from her husband and immigrates to America in 1932 after accepting an offer to become the associate director of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. And while she's here, she meets a number of different scholars like Erich Fromm, Margaret Mead, Harry Stack Sullivan, and Max Wertheimer. And after making a bunch of friends in Chicago, Horney moves to New York to open her own private practice and teach at the New School for Social Research, where she writes and publishes her first 2 books, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time and New Ways in Psychoanalysis. But these books essentially break all of those relationships because they openly criticize Sigmund Freud and all of his followers. In these works, Horney argues against super popular beliefs at the time, like the idea of ego, id, and superego, as well as everyone's favorite, penis envy, claiming that penis envy is nothing but a sexist term that serves as an inaccurate title for the way in which women react to environmental factors that threaten their security. And the Freudian thinkers at the time are not happy with this. After publishing these books and losing favor with a number of her colleagues, she decides it is time to officially separate from her husband and files for divorce, all the while marking her place as the disliked Neo-Freudian member of the New York Psychoanalytic Society. And after facing harsh criticism from her colleagues, she decides to leave. She finds some new friends, and together they found the Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis. And while she's at it, she also decides to serve as both the founder and dean of the American Institute for Psychoanalysis. But she doesn't stop there. Horney is tired of these old-fashioned, sexist Freudian ideas. So she decides to create the American Journal of Psychoanalysis and becomes an editor on top of all of her other responsibilities. And while she's doing all of this, she's also writing and publishing 4 more books. The first of these is Self-Analysis, published in 1942, and in this book, Horney marks herself as a strong supporter of self-analysis, claiming that neuroticism is best understood by the individual facing the neurotic traits. This puts the individual receiving treatment in the driver's seat, allowing them to determine the best course of action for themselves. However, Horney does not discount the role of the analyst in this relationship, stating that most people receiving treatment often have a hard time understanding their neurotic trends, which is where the professional comes in. In Horney's eyes, the role of the analyst is to essentially act as a teacher or guide for the individual in treatment. Now, this might not sound too different from Freud's belief on self-analysis, but the key difference here lies in Horney's belief that individuals are motivated to change their neurotic traits, whereas Freud took on a much more pessimistic approach, claiming that people are not necessarily motivated to change. In her next book, Our Inner Conflicts, published in 1945, Horney discusses 3 definitive types of neurotic expression, with the first being moving toward. This is where the individual holds a strong dependence on others, wanting to be liked and accepted to a detrimental extent. The second is moving against, and this is when people engage in dominance gaining and exploitative behavior. And the last is moving away, where individuals detach from others to avoid feelings of rejection or ridicule. Horney dives into these expressions, defining them and how they develop in childhood through experiences of isolation and rejection. She published her third book, Neurosis and Human Growth, in 1945, and in this one she aligns with Abraham Maslow in the belief that all individuals strive to reach self-actualization. In this one, Horney defines and describes 4 distinct selves. The first is what she calls the real self, and this is the potential for self-growth and improvement in all individuals. It holds an individual's feelings and desires. The second is the actual self, and this one consists of all that makes up a person, their strengths, their weaknesses, as well as their good and bad intentions and behaviors. The third is the idealized self, which consists of an individual's pride and belief that they are, above all else, good. And the last is the hated self, and this one is essentially the opposite of the idealized self, consisting of an individual's self-contempt and obsession over their flaws. And within the book, Horney discusses how individuals may exemplify or diminish certain selves when faced with anxiety or insecurity, which she claims is a partial cause for neurosis. And last but not least, her final book, Feminine Psychology, was published in 1967. And this one is interesting in that the book is essentially a collection of numerous papers written by Horney that work to completely discredit Freud's beliefs on female development. She makes it blatantly clear that human anatomy is not what creates differences between men and women. Rather, she states that these differences are created through environmental factors and culture. Throughout the book, Horney argues that women are deserving of equitable treatment and that the way in which Freud and his followers view women is both sexist and harmful. Now, there is no doubt that Karen Horney had a profound impact on the field of psychology, but it's even more impressive when you consider where she came from. Horney is what Carl Jung might call a wounded healer. She struggled on and off with depression throughout her life, starting in her early teenage years after her parents' separation. She did not have a great relationship with her father, and unfortunately spent most of her childhood living with him and those feelings of isolation that come with depression. And later, in 1923, her husband's business collapsed, and his health followed shortly thereafter as he developed meningitis. And at this same time, Horney lost her brother to a pulmonary infection, all of this leading to her first contemplation of suicide on a family vacation. And yet, despite all of the challenges that she faced, she continued her career and dedicated her life to understanding neuroticism and paved the path to the equitable treatment of women in psychology. Karen Horney is truly an icon. She worked toward expanding psychology for 37 years before dying of cancer on December 4th of 1952.